Hello everybody, I'm Dr. Will Baker from the Centre for Global Englishes at the University of Southampton, and in this presentation I'm going to talk about from communicative competence to intercultural communicative competence and awareness. So the main aim in this presentation is to think about what do we need for successful communication through another language and particular global Englishes. So hopefully this is highly relevant both to you and to your students when thinking about what do they need if they want to use English and other languages and other communicative resources to communicate successfully. So we're going to look at three core concepts in thinking about communication. So the first one we're going to look at is communicative competence, which many of you may already be familiar with. We're then going to go on to intercultural communicative competence, and then lastly look at intercultural awareness. And all of these are an attempt to understand what we need to successfully communicate in another language for intercultural communication. Then lastly we're going to look at the implications for teaching, and especially moving away from inappropriate native English speaker models in English language teaching and use. So we're going to begin by examining communicative competence and thinking about how we might reconceptualize it. In the little diagram here you've got three areas: knowledge, attitudes and skills. I've put these three here as these are typically the three things that people think about or are concerned with when they try to map out the kind of competencies people need for communication. So just to remind you of some of the things we talked about in the previous presentation about intercultural and transcultural communication through English as a global lingua franca, we showed that research had identified very variable, diverse and fluid ways in which language was used in intercultural communication, and also the equally diverse and fluid cultural practices, references and identities that were represented and created through global Englishes. So English was not linked to Anglophone cultures or even any particular culture. So this showed that it's not only language or linguistic forms that are crucial for communication. In English as a lingua franca research and intercultural communication research, it's been shown that communication and pragmatic strategies are often as important as a mastery of linguistic forms. And these include things like accommodation. So this is where participants in our interaction change their language and communicative practices to be closer to each other. Also features like repetition, also clarification requests where you're not sure, and finally let it pass. So only asking for clarification or help when you're sure it's important to the conversation, but also being willing to let things pass. So if you don't understand something and you don't think it's important, just ignoring it for the time being. So communicative and pragmatic strategies are a key part of intercultural communication. However, it's really important that we recognise that these strategies, just as with linguistic forms, need to be used in a variable way. So there isn't one set of pragmatic strategies that will be appropriate in all contexts. They need to be used in an equally adaptable way. And I would argue even more so, these strategies need to be embedded in a wider intercultural awareness on the part of communicators. And I'll talk about that in more detail later. So together, all of these factors have implications on how we view successful communication and how we might teach it. So let's have a look at communicative competence in more detail. This is the concept that many of you may already be familiar with. So in English language teaching in particular, communicative competence has been central for the last 50 years or so. Yeah, and this typically focused on linguistic competence. Yeah, so although communicative competence as conceived by Canali and Swain had linguistic competence, discourse competence and also compensation strategies, the main focus certainly in practice and in teaching is on linguistic competence. And that's typically been a focus on the competence of a monolingual native speaker of the language. Where social cultural aspects are included, and often they're not, but where they are included, these have also been very narrow in how they've been conceived. They're often been based on the intuitions of a particular group of people. So if you look at English language teaching materials, the social cultural aspects typically come from Anglophone, male, white, middle class people. Yeah, and this is very problematic since most global Englishes and intercultural communication does not take place between such groups. So overall we can say that communicative competence has provided us with rather a static representation of communication, a reification or simplification of language, and it misrepresents how in all communication, and in intercultural communication in particular, language and linguistic resources are used in fluid, hybrid and adaptable ways. So unsurprisingly, given the criticisms of communicative competence, various people have worked on reconceptualizing it. So in particular, we need a more flexible approach to language in communicative competence. So instead of looking at a monolingual standard language, it's been argued that we need to approach language as adaptable and of course as a second language, since this is how most people are going to be using global Englishes. But we need to recognise also that successful intercultural communication is about much more than just linguistic forms. So communicative competence is missing much of what is crucial in successful communication. So to make up for these shortfalls in communicative competence, there have been various intercultural alternatives which recognise that second languages are used for intercultural communication. So these are typically extended communicative competence to intercultural communicative competence. So the first model I want to look at is Michael Byram's Intercultural Communicative Competence, because this has been very influential in how language teachers have thought about incorporating the intercultural elements into language teaching. And it's also informed a lot of policy, particularly in Europe, but also I would argue worldwide. So for example, you'll find parts of intercultural communicative competence in the Common European Framework of References for Languages, which some of you may be familiar with. So you can see here at the top of the diagram we have the three traditional elements of communicative competence. So linguistic competence, social linguistic competence and discourse competence. And to these three elements Michael Byram has added intercultural competence, which obviously explicitly recognises the intercultural dimensions to communication through another language. And then he's divided these into what he terms the 5 savoirs. So these are the 5 different elements of intercultural communicative competence. And then he's also added locations of learning, so how this intercultural competence can be learned, so either in the classroom, in fieldwork, by that he means using a language outside the classroom, and independent learning by the students. So I think intercultural communicative competence has a lot to offer and has been very helpful for expanding communicative competence to a more intercultural dimension and a better recognition of how people actually use a second language. So there's an emphasis on a wider range of knowledge, skills and attitude related to second language use in intercultural communication. There's a particular emphasis on things like mediation and negotiation in communication. And a central concept for Michael Byram is critical cultural awareness, which he defines as an ability to evaluate critically and on the basis of explicit criteria, perspectives, practices and products in one's own and other cultures and countries. Now I think that's really important, that last point about critical cultural awareness. So this idea of critical evaluation and being able to compare critically our own perspectives and others. But I also think there's a problem, because it's very much fixed on cultures and countries. And as we discussed in the previous presentation, global Englishes for intercultural and transcultural communication is not just linked to cultures and countries. It can easily transcend such borders. So the focus on the national scale and national cultures is problematic. It is not well suited to global Englishes and ELF and transcultural communication, where there are no clear other cultures, countries or nations to link the language to. So an alternative to this is intercultural awareness. So intercultural awareness very much builds on intercultural communicative competence, but is better suited, I would argue, to intercultural communication through English as a lingua franca. So this is a more dynamic conception of competence, which is better suited to the multilingual and multicultural nature of intercultural and transcultural communication that transcends the national scale. So intercultural awareness can be defined as a conscious understanding of the role of culturally based forms, practices and frames of reference can have in intercultural communication, and an ability to put these concepts into practice in a flexible and context-specific manner in communication. So in this conception there's an emphasis on process and practice. So it's about processes of communication and communicative practices rather than linguistic forms or any particular one set of communicative or pragmatic strategies. Negotiation and fluidity or adaptability is central. There's a specific focus on English as a lingua franca and intercultural and transcultural communication, where national scales for culture and language are just one of many scales and may not always be, and in fact frequently are not, the relevant scale. Okay, so to explain intercultural awareness in a little bit more detail and perhaps make it more concrete for teaching, we can divide intercultural awareness into three different levels. So we begin with basic cultural awareness, then we can move to advanced cultural awareness, and these two levels, I would argue, are similar to Byram's earlier intercultural communicative competence. But crucially, we also have this third level, intercultural awareness. So in intercultural awareness, there's an awareness that cultural frames of reference, forms and communicative practices can be related both to specific cultures but also emergent and hybrid in intercultural communication. There's also an awareness that initial interaction in intercultural communication might be based on cultural stereotypes or generalizations, but participants can quickly move beyond these. And there's a capacity to negotiate and mediate between different emergent socio-culturally grounded communicative modes and frames of reference based on this understanding of culture in intercultural communication. So overall, the three levels are useful as a way of thinking about how learners and users of English as a global lingua franca can move through different stages in their understanding of the intercultural processes. And it extends communicative competence beyond the narrow focus on linguistic forms and on simplistic Anglophone cultural representations. So, in sum, we can say there's been a move in thinking from communicative competence to intercultural awareness. And this move involves an awareness of the needs of global Englishes for intercultural and transcultural communication, a replacement of the inappropriate monolingual native speaker model, and a replacement more with an intercultural global Englishes or ELF speaker. Going beyond linguistic forms in our understanding of competence and including communicative and pragmatic strategies, but also wider linguistic and intercultural awareness in which these knowledge, skills and attitudes to do with pragmatic strategies, etc. are embedded. And it's important to emphasise that any specification of competencies or awareness must be general, since the specific features of what people will actually do in communication will always be situationally dependent. So there's a focus on process and criticality. Okay, so that's the theory. So what does this mean for teaching? So I have argued that currently the predominant focus in English language teaching is on the teaching of a fixed linguistic code based on a narrow interpretation of the already limited notion of communicative competence. In ELT, English is still principally associated linguistic and culturally with the Anglophone world, and within this a very narrow section of that world. Typically, as I've said before, white, middle class, male and monolingual. And I do realise I fit all of those categories, so it is slightly ironic that I'm arguing against them. However, such knowledge and skills are unlikely to equip learners of English for the variable demands of intercultural communication through English as a lingua franca. So English language teaching, I think, needs to change, and indeed is changing. And I think the crucial way this is changing is through replacing the native speaker. So models and goals for teaching need to move away from inappropriate, idealised monolingual native speakers to multilingual intercultural speakers. So the intercultural speaker has the competencies and awareness of intercultural communicative competence and intercultural awareness. They have knowledge, skills and attitudes of multilingual English users for intercultural and transcultural communication. Yeah, and I think this is a much more suitable model both for teachers and learners, and also a much more achievable model. Yep, learners are never going to become native speakers of British or American English, or very unlikely to become so, and have very little need to become so. Whereas the model of an intercultural speaker with intercultural communicative competence and awareness is an achievable model. And indeed, I would argue that many local teachers already provide a good model or example of such an intercultural speaker. So, to summarise those points, we're moving from communicative competence to intercultural awareness when we think about what is needed for successful communication through global Englishes. So the fluidity and diversity of intercultural and transcultural communication through global Englishes means we need to rethink our notions of what makes successful communication. It's not just mastery of a coded set of features of a named language, so for example British English. So successful communication goes beyond grammar, vocabulary and phonology. Pragmatics and other communicative strategies are equally important, but they also need to be seen as variable and fluid in their use. So there's no one set of communicative or pragmatic strategies that will always be appropriate. And crucially, all of this needs to be embedded in a wider understanding of the fluidity of languages and cultures and dynamic links between them, and familiarity with the processes of intercultural communication, as well as open attitudes to diversity, change and difference. For teaching, this means we need to move from a native speaker to an intercultural speaker. So the native speaker model typically involves mastery of a fixed linguistic code, for example standard British English, familiarity with the social cultural norms of a stable national community and culture, so British English linked to British culture or UK culture, and a monolingual and monocultural orientation, all of which I would argue are inappropriate and in many cases irrelevant to learners and users of global Englishes. The alternative is an intercultural speaker model. So this is a multilingual English user, which is the majority of the world's users of English, with adaptable use of languages combined with communicative and pragmatic strategies. Familiarity with the processes of intercultural and transcultural communication, with flexible approaches to communicative and other cultural practices, and a multilingual and intercultural orientation. Yeah, and I think this is a much more appropriate and achievable model. Okay, here are my references. Thank you very much. Dosha, and I'll look forward to talking to you in the next video.